So
we'll be starting shortly, just settle in. Please feel free to use the chat box to say hello to everyone and do tell us where you come from. Make sure you direct it to all panellists and attendees. We will be starting shortly. Welcome. Welcome to CIPS South Australian Branch webinar on the topic of social procurement. What's the buzz? I'd like to advise everyone that this webinar is currently being recorded and will be made available to all attendees next week. Now, a very warm welcome to you all. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands we meet on today and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In addition, Tēnā koukou, tēnā koukou, tēnā koukou katoa to those participating from New Zealand. I'm really excited to say we have over 200 registered attendees for today's session, and I'm pleased to say that this is our first South Australian branch hosted webinar. Absolutely thrilled to have Caroline Locke, Director of Procurement and Grants at the Department of Human Services, who will be presenting today. Again, please use the chat box to say hello to us all, tell us where you're from and make sure you direct it to all panellists and attendees. For those who don't know us, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, CIPS. CIPS is your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals. We're actually your professional partner for life. We're here to support you through your journey, your professional journey, and with that support comes knowledge. And today's webinar is just one way that we're sharing knowledge, and there are so many other avenues to get information, in particular through the CIPS Knowledge Hub. As a member of CIPS, you're a trusted professional. You've passed the highest procurement standards and code of conduct and ethics. We're here to ensure you're successful and you're in demand. And research tells us that MCIPS and FCIPS means that something to employers. And according to the latest CIPS Hayes survey guide, if you have MCIPS, you're likely to earn 31% more. And most importantly, CIPS is your gateway to connections, networking, and being part of procurement community. And right now, there's never been a better time to be connected, particularly virtual connectivity. And we're seeing some great examples of our global community connecting, sharing ideas and advice. Now more than ever, let's support each other. So get connected and start conversations through CIPS LinkedIn groups, the CIPS ANZ group, and the global site, CIPS Connect and Exchange. So yet again, warm welcome, and without further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Giovanni Ferrante, who is the host and moderator for the webinar today. Welcome, Gio.
thank you, Sharon, and welcome to everyone again. It's a great pleasure to be the host for today's webinar. It's on a topic that's very important and very dear to CIPS' heart and very close to my heart as well. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of today's session, just a few housekeeping notes. So as Sharon mentioned, the webinar is recorded and will be made available later next week to all in attendance and all of those that have registered. All attendees are muted, but you will have an opportunity to interact. There'll be plenty of time at the end of the session to ask your questions to Caroline and interact throughout the session with her using the chat box. Feel free to tell us where you're from, to tell us what your passion is and why you decided to join this session and what you're hoping to achieve through the chat box, and start thinking and picking your brain on what kind of question you like answered from our expert speakers today. Social procurement, as I mentioned, is something extremely close to CIPS' heart. As an organisation that at a foundation of its existence, has the mandate to do public good, social procurement sits right in that space. That's basically an enablement for procurement to deliver way beyond return on assets for goods and services, and actually impacting community, actually impacting the environment, and deliver great benefit to the whole of society. So I don't want to steal any more time to Caroline's amazing presentation. So before I hand over to her, I'm just going to make a quick introduction and tell you what Caroline is. So Caroline Locke has been the Director of Procurement and Grants in the Department of Human Services since 2017. She started a career in the Electricity Trust of South Australia as a graduate and worked as trust economist and domestic market dealer before taking on pricing and project implementation roles associated with the national electricity markets. And joining the South Australian government in 2004, Caroline joined the procurement team in the Department of Transport, Planning and Infrastructure, followed by the Department of Further Education, Employment, Science and Technology in 2007, and then the Department of Human Services in 2011, where she was appointed as the Manager of Procurement and Grants. She's a Bachelor in Economics and is an affiliate member of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Caroline on the session and hand over to her. Thank you, Caroline, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Gio. It's good to be here today. I'm pleased to be here to share my experience with social procurement. And first of all, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country as well. I'm just having a slight technical issue myself, but all good. So I acknowledge and respect the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we're meeting on today. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of Aboriginal peoples to country. And I'd also like to pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people attending from other areas of South Australia and Australia who are present here. And for the New Zealanders amongst us, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. To explain why social procurement is so important to me, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Department of Human Services where I work. Our portfolio covers early intervention services for children and families to prevent them from entering the child protection system. We have disability accommodation services, youth justice, the Office for Women, domestic and family violence services, youth programs, Office for Volunteers, gambling help services, financial counselling and emergency financial assistance programs for low-income earners, community passenger networks, funding for carers, funding for the not-for-profit sector, and advocacy support. Concessions and programs for low-income earners. For example, we have energy concession programs, a funeral scheme, a personal alert rebate scheme, and a scheme for glasses and contact lenses. We also offer a range of grants to community organisations for various purposes, usually around strengthening communities and supporting vulnerable people. And now we're going to get the ball rolling with a poll. Sophia is going, I think, to pop the poll up for us. So the question is, how much involvement have you had in social procurement? So this will help me have a gauge of where everyone's at in their social procurement knowledge and experience. Do you know all about social procurement and you've already got experience in implementing social procurement strategies? Are you familiar with the concept of social procurement and have some practical experience, or are you asking yourself, what is social procurement? So if everyone can vote, if you can't see the poll, it may be hidden behind a window. So you may just have to have a look for it. And we're just going to vote on that now. Okay, the results show that 17% of you are very familiar with social procurement, very experienced. 64% of you, the majority, are familiar with the concept of social procurement and you already have some practical experience, and 19% of you are fairly new to social procurement. So that's a good mix across the board. So let's start with the basics. What is social procurement? There are a number of, Sophia, I was supposed to tell you when we were doing the slides. I apologise. I failed in Zoom Keeping Webinar 101. I just have to say, I can't see the slide. Let me just, okay. Thank you. Apologies, everybody. We should be back on track now. So, what is social procurement? There are a number of ways you can define social procurement, but it's important to get the definition right for your organisation because it helps you set targets and priorities as an organisation and to generate a common understanding. In the Department of Human Services, we already contract with a lot of not-for-profit organisations to deliver services. So if we included expenditure with not-for-profit organisations in our definition of social procurement, we would have already met our targets before we started. So instead, we choose to focus on using our spend to generate social value above and beyond the value of the good or service we're procuring. Okay, next slide, Sophia. So social procurement can loosely be put into two categories in my experience, direct and indirect social procurement. Direct social procurement includes procuring goods and services from not-for-profit organisations, social enterprises, Aboriginal businesses and disability enterprises, whereas indirect social procurement includes things like inserting social clauses into contracts, assessing tenderers' social procurement credentials via tender responses and requiring suppliers to report on outcomes. When we started on our social procurement journey, our focus was mainly on asking suppliers what they were already doing in the environmental and social procurement space and assessing and recording what they told us. We weren't specifying what we wanted or asking them to change what they were doing for us as a customer. For example, we used to allocate a percentage weighting and a score out of 10 for any initiatives tenderers could tell us about, from greening initiatives, staff volunteering programs, donations, etc. Don't get me wrong, these things are important, but they don't strongly signal to our suppliers that we value social procurement, and they don't encourage a change in behaviour from suppliers. And these types of strategies also don't allow us to leverage our spend for social good. So we have moved progressively from this type of what I would call almost passive social procurement to more active strategies, such as stating our preference for Aboriginal businesses and disability enterprises and encouraging partnerships between mainstream suppliers and social enterprises. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Why do we care about social procurement? DHS's vision is fairness, opportunity and choice for all South Australians. My interest in social procurement was triggered when I joined the Department of Human Services. DHS's core business is to improve the lives of all South Australians, acknowledging that some people in our community need more support than others to get a fair go. I was also fortunate to join the procurement team at a time when the previous director, Kelly Tattersall, had already put a lot of effort into social procurement initiatives. So I was not starting from scratch. Fortunately, given the like-minded people that I work with, social procurement isn't a hard sell in DHS. For example, DHS is the lead government agency in South Australia for the state's Disability Access and Inclusion Plan, and there's good alignment and opportunity between the Disability Access and Inclusion Plan and social procurement. The South Australian Government also has someone in our Office for the Industry Advocate who's dedicated to supporting South Australian Aboriginal businesses to get more work. And this is excellent support for the work that we do in the Department of Human Services. Next slide. So how do we do social procurement? Social procurement strategies such as allowing direct negotiation with Aboriginal businesses and Australian disability enterprises rather than seeking 3 quotes are written into DHS's procurement policy framework. There's a value for money test associated with these direct negotiations, but just by making it simpler for business units to source goods and services from Aboriginal businesses and disability enterprises, we're encouraging spend with these organisations. We've raised the profile of our social procurement strategies by including them in organisational strategic plans, such as our Reconciliation Action Plan and our Disability Access and Inclusion Plan. And as I said before, DHS has a cross-government responsibility for disability access and inclusion plans, with our plan available as an exemplar for other government agencies and local government. So this is a good way to show other government agencies what they can do in terms of social procurement. In 2018-19, we created our first social procurement action plan, where we collected all of our initiatives in one place and we set ourselves targets and stretch goals for what we wanted to achieve. Some of the actions were around specific procurements we'd identified from our forward procurement plan. For example, our cleaning and our groceries tenders. For our cleaning contract, we identified through market research that there are a number of ABEs operating in this space. At that stage, we didn't have buy-in from our assets and facilities business units, so we had to start early in the planning process, introducing the idea of engaging an Aboriginal business to deliver at least part of the service. I also assigned our internal social procurement champion, one of our senior procurement advisors, to work with the business unit on the procurement strategy. And the result was that an ABE was engaged, an Aboriginal business was engaged to provide part of DHS's cleaning requirements. Sometimes we found we may not be able to achieve social outcomes immediately on signing the contract, but we found that you can set the contract up during the tender process and contract negotiations so that it's ready to activate when the conditions are right. An example of this is our groceries contracts, which include a provision to employ South Australian Housing Trust tenants. The Housing Trust implemented a training and employment scheme for its tenants, who are some of the most vulnerable people in the community. And as a sister agency of ours, we leveraged and tied into that so that when the time is right, we'll be able to negotiate for these tenants to be employed by our groceries suppliers, because that's what the suppliers signed up for when we awarded them the contract. Some of the other initiatives in our social procurement action plan were to increase our networks. For example, we connected with a South Australian business called Abella Foods. Abella makes hummus and dips, so far from what we do in DHS, but it was fantastic to meet with them, talk with them and share our experiences and ideas for social procurement, and that's really worked well for us. We're also not shy about promoting our successes, both within our organisation, in our regular weekly DHS newsletter, and also externally, such as last year's write-up in the Global CIPS Journal. Okay, next slide. So some concrete examples of social procurement in the Department of Human Services. I've already mentioned DHS policy for the last 10 years has been to waive the competitive process and directly source goods and services from Aboriginal businesses and disability enterprises to the value of $220,000. And in recent years, I'm pleased to say that this initiative has been adopted across the South Australian government in relation to Aboriginal businesses. But building the capacity of Aboriginal businesses and disability enterprises over time to take on bigger contracts is probably one of the most successful initiatives. Minda is a South Australian disability enterprise which provides linen and laundry services for clients in state-run disability accommodation. When we started, Minda was a subcontractor to our provider, who was a multinational linen company, and Minda was engaged just to launder clients' clothes. From there, Minda took on greater scope over successive contracts, and they upgraded their commercial laundry to the point where they are now DHS's sole provider of linen and laundry services. Minda won the most recent contract through a competitive tender process against mainstream suppliers. An example of a strategy to significantly increase spends with Aboriginal businesses is in the early stages, but it's promising some good results. As I mentioned before, DHS is responsible for early intervention services for vulnerable children and families, which aim to reduce the number of children in the statutory child protection system. As a department, we've commenced a recommissioning process for these services in the last 12 months, and this has also provided a significant opportunity to increase engagement and spend with Aboriginal businesses. In conjunction with our Community and Family Services Division, the procurement unit has worked on a consultation and co-design process with the non-government sector, which has led to a common understanding and agreement that if we get the system right for Aboriginal children and their families, the same system principles will deliver better services to children and families from other backgrounds too. So what this means in practice is that we're looking to provide significant funding to Aboriginal businesses to provide these early intervention services to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal families. Funding has been set aside to support these Aboriginal businesses to scale up and develop the additional capacity and expertise needed to deliver the services. And finally, an example of the use of Aboriginal businesses as subcontractors to our main stationery supplier. We engaged Wink through a competitive process, and part of that evaluation was assessing Wink's capability against a range of social procurement objectives. During the contract term, we've been able to work with Wink to increase our spend, for example, through buying products from Aboriginal businesses. Wink has been responsive in suggesting opportunities to increase our spend with Aboriginal businesses, and they make it easy for us to do that through their online catalogue. By selecting an organisation that has good social procurement credentials itself, it's been straightforward for us to enhance our social procurement outcomes through the life of the contract. Thank you, Sophia. We're ready for the next slide now. So how do we measure success? Well, I will admit this is one of our biggest challenges, and it's something that is still a work in progress for us. Systems have not helped in this regard, but this is hopefully about to change. We're currently implementing a new procurement and contract management system, and we should be able to generate customised reports and report on these types of measures. So our current measures are our Aboriginal spend target, which is across South Australian government target of 0.5%. And against that target, DHS achieved a 2% of our spend with Aboriginal businesses in 2018-19, which was $7.5 million. Other measures that we use are the amount of spend with disability enterprises and social enterprises, the number of contracts that have social procurement outcomes, and the number of different types of staff, Aboriginal staff or staff with disability that are employed by our contractors. Okay, it's time for another poll, which I think is going to magically appear on our screens. Thank you. So this question is, in 2018-19, how much did South Australian government agencies spend with local South Australian Aboriginal businesses? So I've told you what DHS spent, but how much did the whole of the South Australian government spend? Was it $5 million? Was it $20 million? Or was it $50 million? And if you can't see the quiz, it may be behind another window. And the answers are, the most common answer was $20 million. Well, I'm pleased to say we exceeded most people's expectations. The South Australian government, in fact, spent $50 million with Aboriginal businesses in 2018-19, $50.9 million to be exact, with an additional $14.9 million on indirect spend on major projects. So that was an excellent result, and something that our Premier and all the government agencies are very proud of. Okay, on to the next slide, which is recognition of DHS achievement. So it's nice to do this social procurement work, and we don't do it for the recognition, but it is also nice to be acknowledged for the work that we do. In 2014, DHS won a CIPS award for the best example of socially responsible procurement. In 2015, we were a finalist in the Australian Social Enterprise Awards. In 2019, as I mentioned before, we had a feature article in the CIPS International Supply Management magazine. And earlier this year, we were acknowledged by the South Australian Premier for exceeding the government Aboriginal procurement spend target fourfold. So there are some nice recognitions of our achievements. And finally, next slide, please, Sophia. I'm going to leave you with some hints and tips from my own experience. Start small and keep trying. It sounds obvious, but you need to be persistent to get social procurement outcomes, in my experience. Sometimes we've identified the perfect procurement process for social procurement outcomes, and either through lack of buy-in from the business owner or perhaps not having the time to plan out the social procurement strategy, we've missed an opportunity. But there'll always be another opportunity. And if you have enough time, hence my second tip, to target projects with a reasonable lead time, you increase your chances of a successfully executed social procurement strategy. In South Australian Government, we have an obligation to publish our forward procurement plan. And this is good for suppliers, so they know what work is coming up that they can tender for. But it's also good for the procurement unit, because it means we can look ahead for future opportunities for social procurement. Engage with stakeholders. Again, it sounds obvious, and we think we know the players pretty well, but we always learn something new when we get out there and we talk to Aboriginal businesses, and we talk to disability enterprises, and we talk to social enterprises. So there's so much that you can learn from engaging with your stakeholders in this area. And finally, engage in shameless self-promotion. It's worked for us, and it can work for you too. Well, I hope I've managed to convey to you my enthusiasm for social procurement and explain to you why it's a hot topic for me and my organisation. Thank you very much for your time. I think we're going to move on to some questions now, if anyone has any.
Right. Thank you very much, Caroline. That was brilliant, and there was some really tangible example of what you've achieved. Again, to encourage others and hopefully inspire to pursue same objectives. There's a lot of questions that started to trickle from the audience. There's one that I'd like to ask you first. What are the top two things, just pick two out of all the amazing work that you're doing with your team, you know, that have really made a big difference in delivering your social procurement strategy at DHS?
Thanks, Gio. I think two things that I could pinpoint are, firstly, our social procurement action plan. There's nothing like documenting your intentions and setting targets and telling people what you're going to do to keep you honest and accountable and make you actually do that. So that's been really good at helping us advance social procurement in our department. And secondly, I would say, as I ended the presentation, promoting and celebrating our successes. So the more our DHS colleagues internally know about the work we're doing in social procurement, the easier it's been to introduce the idea and get them on board to you know, use the procurement process to seek social outcomes. So it's good for them as well, and they enjoy the acknowledgement that they receive.
No, that's brilliant. That's certainly an inspiration for colleagues in other areas of your government departments. Questions are coming through fast and thick. So let's start with Rosie. She has a very interesting one. How do you approach your head contractors about directing them to employ subcontractors in the social procurement space? So how can you leverage your probably negotiation power to get them to do the same and work with Aboriginal businesses, for example? So
the way we've done it, we've done it from the outset of the procurement process. So we've written it into our tender specification. We've talked about it at our industry briefings. We've made it clear that it's part of the evaluation criteria. So we've done that up front. And we've also acknowledged that sometimes that can take a bit of extra time. So we might have had a longer tender open period for that particular procurement to give the organisations time to think through what it is that we're asking of them. I think it is also possible to do it while you're in contract, as part of regular contract management and looking at opportunities for improving a contract while it's underway, but we haven't personally used that approach in DHS yet.
Perfect. And there's a specific question about whether WING, the organisation that you work with, is actually able to report on the dollar value that goes to Aboriginal business as opposed to the value of the Aboriginal product. Feel free if there's any sensitivity issue not to discuss.
No, there's no sensitivity around that. Yes, absolutely. WING are able to report on the dollar value that we spend with Aboriginal businesses, and we find that helpful.
That's brilliant. And in terms of policies or incentives by the state government to encourage private enterprises to get involved with, procurement, is there any direction that the government is taking? For example, ADs.
So the government does provide support for Aboriginal businesses. The position that I mentioned previously in the Office for the Industry Advocate is absolutely there as a source of assistance for Aboriginal businesses who are looking to tender for government work. And I know that the Industry Advocate also provides tender-ready training to assist small to medium enterprises to tender for government work. Is that what the nature of the question was, Gio?
Yeah. You've touched to a degree. There was probably an additional angle on whether the government encourages the business, particularly the one that they work with, to follow the similar path as far as social procurement policy.
I see. Yeah, I don't think I can actually answer that from my own personal experience. I would hope so, and there's absolutely no reason why not. I know, well, I probably won't speak on behalf of another government agency, but I'm aware of at least one South Australian government agency that has been working on with head contractors to encourage the subcontractors to have more social procurement outcomes.
Perfect, thanks, Carolyn. In terms of the success that you had working with your Aboriginal suppliers, has there been any strategy or particular approach that it's been particularly successful that others might be able to replicate?
So I would say that we have been, we set up our tender specification and our evaluation methodology to be flexible. So we're very clear that we state that we want to engage with an Aboriginal business, but in terms of the decision or the ability, I guess, to break up the scope of the tender. So we make that clear up front, and we follow through what we say we're going to do, but we might say up front that we might offer the contract to one or more suppliers. And I think breaking down sometimes the scope of contracts into smaller parcels, that can help Aboriginal businesses that are looking to get off, to get a leg in into government work. And that's been successful for us.
Really good. There's another question that often comes as a challenge in engaging social enterprise or Aboriginal businesses. This is one based on the perception that it's more costly to engage with those organisations. So the question coming is, one of the public fund utilisation principles is to encourage competition and get a good price. Any good procurement practice says the same. So how do you negate the argument of competitive principle to use public funds in your experience? So,
yeah, well, I would say absolutely. We have not found that it costs more to engage with Aboriginal businesses or disability enterprises, and so it hasn't affected the bottom line for us. And I think that a lot of people will tell you that actually it doesn't cost more.
Absolutely. Looking from our experience in working with a lot of organisations that operate in that space, that seems to be like a big blocker to engagement. If you think about the full cost of engaging with this business from a government perspective, there might be hidden costs as far as supporting those communities if they're not integrated back into the workforce. This far exceeds the cost of engaging with them throughout the procurement process. So a lot of this misperception might be unfounded when you actually realize that for the economy, for the agency as a whole, there is a much bigger benefit that might be, a very small thing compared to the additional cost that might be required in engaging those businesses. So thanks for your insight. Right, questions are coming very fast. So how do you best evaluate through the tender process private companies and scoring against those that don't have social impact? You mentioned that a lot of those criteria are not embedded in the actual tender evaluation, so I suspect there should be no tender submission that don't meet that criteria, but how do you balance that scale?
So we would have a range of criteria that we would assess against for each tender that we have, and we generally would weight those criteria, and the social procurement outcomes would have a weighting. And that would change, that varies for the different projects depending on what outcomes we think we might be able to get versus how suitable the particular good or service is to lending itself to social procurement outcomes. But we would set a criteria and we would weight it, and then we would assess the tenders against it. So if we got a tender that didn't demonstrate many outcomes that we were looking for, then they would get a lower score for that criteria.
Perfect. Thank you, Caroline. Someone's asking, it's more of a semantic question on, given that you've properly listed Aboriginal business in your definition of social procurement, do you have an opinion on whether they should be considered a social enterprise? And I think the answer is they are considered as social enterprises, but what's your experience, Caroline?
So my understanding is that I think social enterprises are slightly different. I'm not a full bottle on this, but social enterprises compared to not-for-profit organisations is slightly different. So I think a social enterprise, it can make enough profit to keep it running or something like that, but it doesn't have charity status. So then it would depend on how the Aboriginal business was categorised. So whether it was a not-for-profit organisation or perhaps it is a social enterprise set up to make a small profit. I don't know.
And there are plenty of organisations that can help you answer those specific questions. Organisations that have a list of registered suppliers, both for Indigenous businesses and social enterprises.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're not sure whether an organisation is a not-for-profit, then you can tell it should be on the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission website. So that's another way to tell whether an organisation is a not-for-profit or perhaps a social enterprise.
Thank you, Caroline. Another question, how many staff do you have operating in your social procurement team?
Well, we don't have a social procurement team, we just have a procurement team. And there are 14 of us, including me.
So the love is shared across all of the team members in keeping social procurement at the front mind.
Exactly, yes.
Perfect. Just touching, someone's asking an interesting question. Is there a difference between social and sustainable procurement in your view?
I would say that, no, I would say that they're fairly interchangeable, because I think that by definition, sustainable procurement does include socially responsible procurement because it's social sustainability. Sustainability sometimes has that sort of air of it's around the environment, but I think that it can be argued that sustainable procurement includes social procurement.
All right, now a timely question on that relates to the current situation. So the pandemic hitting the world so hard, what impact have you seen in the social enterprise space that you work with? And how do you think the Australian government, certainly the South Australian government, is helping social enterprise to survive?
Well, I can say from my own perspective in the Department of Human Services, we've provided a lot of funding and support to the not-for-profit sector, which includes social enterprises and Aboriginal businesses and disability enterprises. And some of that has been specific funding to keep them going or to buy additional equipment that they might need during COVID. And some of it has been in just providing information and advice and generally supporting them. So as a department, we've done a lot in that space to support those organisations that we partner with.
Perfect. And this is a sort of governance and compliance questions. Do you have any particular step that you use to vet whether suppliers are effectively Aboriginal businesses or social enterprise before you engage them?
Not a particular thing. We would just do our investigations. As I said before, determining whether an organisation is a not-for-profit is relatively straightforward. But in terms of social enterprises, that's probably less clear, but something that you could find out by even discussing with them or researching the particular organisation.
Perfect. Another question is, some people might think that if you can quantify the outcomes in dollar value, then is it really worth doing? But first of all, you have shown the quantifiable measure of the outcomes, but what would you say to people that bring this objection?
Yeah, sure. I would say two things. I would say one, that actually quite a lot of work has been done on quantifying the benefits of social procurement. I know that there's an academic from one of the South Australian universities who undertook a specific study to quantify the dollar benefits for one of the South Australian Housing Authority's social procurement schemes. And I believe Social Traders has also done quite a lot of work in this area. Secondly, I would say that there are other ways to quantify benefits without using dollars. We use a method of measuring benefits and outcomes in DHS called results-based accountability. And this tracks data against three measures, which are how much did we do, how well did we do it, and is anyone better off? And you can get quantitative data from those types of measures, not dollars, but still you can quantitatively measure the outcomes.
Brilliant. And this is a bit of a reflection for you. If you had to start your journey over and, with the benefit of hindsight, what are two things or three, or pick as many as you want, that you would do differently to help both the impact and the speed of achieving certain outcomes?
Yep. I would, as I've kind of mentioned in one of my earlier answers, I would actually do a social procurement action plan earlier. That has been really beneficial for us as a department and for us as a procurement unit specifically as well. So I would get onto that earlier. I would also do more work engaging with internal stakeholders earlier, promoting the benefits and advantages of social procurement.
Awesome. Do you have any program that invests in the development of the current suppliers that you work with in that space?
So in Department of Human Services, as I mentioned earlier, with one of the programs that we have for early intervention services, we are looking at using some funding to invest in capability building with some Aboriginal businesses. And more broadly than Department of Human Services, as I mentioned, I think the Office of the Industry Advocate has some support, probably not investment funding like we do, but other programs that support the development of those businesses.
Thanks, Carol. And there are a few questions around very specific, whether there are a single point of information. As we mentioned, there's a number of organisations that have a verified registry of both Indigenous enterprise, and that is Supply Nation in Australia,
Yes.
Social Traders, that's the same in the social enterprise space. Akina in New Zealand is another organisation, so you can use those as a sanity check to effectively...
Yeah, and viability as well, which is, so it's B-U-Y, capital A, B-I-L-I-T-Y, and that has a list of disability enterprises that offer goods and services. So that's another good resource.
Awesome. Another question on the tender side, and this is more looking at any advice on best practice that you're using to evaluate effectively that component that you ask as a requirement for your tender submissions.
Sorry, Gio, could you just say that again?
Sorry, any particular advice on best practice when you evaluate your tender responses on the social procurement criteria? Any particular things to be mindful of? Any advice? Any things to look for?
No, not specifically, but I would say one of the things we do when we evaluate tenders is we have a scale, if you like, of you know, if we were to award a 10, this is what we would expect in a response. If we were to award a 9, this is what we'd expect. And we actually do that as part of the planning for the tender process. We document that in our acquisition plans. And that does really help crystallise the evaluation team up front in terms of what they're looking for and what they're expecting. So I think that's a useful tool and approach, but that we use that for all procurements, not specifically social procurement.
Absolutely, and I'd imagine it will be a similar approach for the ongoing review through the contract period. Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, I think I missed a slide now that I think about it, because what I was going to say is that it's very important you can negotiate these wonderful social procurement outcomes through a tender or through a direct negotiation, but you actually need to monitor them through the life of the contract. And one of the things that we do in the Department of Human Services is we have a pretty rigorous contract management framework and very regular contract management reporting. So for significant contracts, business units need to report back every 6 months and on a range of measures to do with the contract. But one of those is performance against the KPIs and the outcomes negotiated as part of the contract. And I think that's really important. Because otherwise some of these things, benefits that you've negotiated, can just slip away.
Perfect. And one question that relates to a comment that you made earlier about waiving a waiver for competitive process in your procurement policies for the ABs and ADs. Could you explain a little bit further the execution of this particular process by the business?
Yeah, sure. So normally, and I probably won't go into too much detail about South Australian Government normal procurement policy, but normally anytime you have a requirement above 33,000, we actually need to go and get 3 quotes from 3 suppliers. But with Aboriginal businesses and disability enterprises in the Department of Human Services, if you can find an Aboriginal business or a disability enterprise that can provide the good or service you're after up to the value of 220,000, it means you don't need to get the 3 quotes. So you do need to do a value for money check, make sure that we're not paying way out of whack. But yeah, so it simplifies the process, which I think is the sweetener for some of our business units. But it does encourage then that if there happens to be an Aboriginal business or a disability enterprise that can provide that good or service, then it encourages purchasing direct from them.
Very good. Still got a few questions, very mindful of time, and we're going through a lot of them, which is absolutely brilliant. So we're really taking your brain, and thanks again for sharing your insights. You did mention, that one of the things you would have done sooner was probably your your social procurement plan. Someone's, I guess, curious on how tricky it was to get your social procurement action plan agreed by the business. Was there any resistance at all? Was there any pushback?
No, there wasn't. So we did our inaugural one in 2018-19. It required a little bit of light negotiation with some other areas of our department, but we made sure that most of the initiatives we put in there were under the control of our procurement team, which we made as a deliberate decision, thinking we'll start with something that we can control and manage, and then we'll build from there. And go organisation. So we might in future put initiatives that are the responsibility of some of the other areas in DHS, but no. And our governance committee was supportive, so you know, they were happy to endorse it, as was the executive leadership team of the department.
Perfect, thanks, Caroline. One more question. Someone, I guess, comes from a private sector background, is asking whether you have any advice on how to actually implement the social procurement strategy when there are very strict criteria to onboard local Aboriginal businesses.
Sorry, Gio, can you just say that one again?
Forgive me. So whether you have any advice for someone in the private sector who's keen to engage Aboriginal businesses but has very strict criteria on how to do that. Do you have any advice, anything that might help sell it to the business?
That's an interesting one. I would say that a lot of Aboriginal businesses are capable of providing goods and services in the same way that many mainstream businesses are. So perhaps taking the label of Aboriginal business off the organisation and just treating it as a business, and maybe engaging in that way. I'm not sure if I'm understanding exactly the question, or maybe the question assumes you would have to pay more, but I can't imagine anyone having a policy that would prevent you from purchasing from an Aboriginal business.
That was very helpful, and if I can add, think about potentially how your risk profile might decrease. If we look at this current scenario where the continuity of certain goods and services being questioned because supply chains have been disrupted, certainly working with local organisation might help decrease your risk profile, ensure continuity of supply, and feed a positive circle as a whole. I think we are nearly there. I'm going to ask you one last question, and this is more on the sort of like personal skill set, just to wrap up the event. Is there a different skill set that you need as a procurement professional to undertake social procurement initiative as opposed to the traditional ones?
Sure. So I guess this depends on how you define traditional procurement skill set. And it's funny you should ask that question, because I was just talking the other day with Craig Lardner, who many of you may know through CIPS, about this. And my quick answer to that question would be, well, no, of course not. You know, the same high-level communication, project management, stakeholder engagement skills, grit, determination, persistence that are present in any high-performing procurement officer are exactly the skills that you need to execute a successful social procurement strategy. But in what is perhaps an indication of Craig's slightly advanced years compared to mine, forgive me, Craig, he reminded me that if we consider traditional procurement as the olden days when procurement was seen as interchangeable with purchasing, and it was seen as an administrative task completed in the back office, then yes, I would say there is a different skill set required for social procurement than traditional procurement. So maybe it depends how you define it, but I would say that anyone who's working in procurement today has the right skill set to be successful in social procurement.
Fabulous and very encouraging. I take it that means don't find any excuse not to do it, just get out there and get cracking with it, which is really encouraging everyone on this call and beyond to just give it a go, because that's what it is. Caroline, it's been an absolute pleasure having you sharing your your amazing insight, your success story. Congratulations to you and your team for the amazing work that you're doing, enabling and supporting communities and delivering far beyond what government expectations are. And we've seen some really tangible example, both financially, but more importantly on the community side of what good social procurement strategies can actually do for the organisation and for those communities that might not have the same opportunities that others have. So thank you again very much for sharing your insight, and keep up the good work. So if I can just like make a couple of like final remark from my perspective and what I've learned from you, include target in your plan, just communicate it to the team, get people on board, get them excited. You talked a lot about, especially in your, if I was to go back into engaging the business a lot earlier in the process, I think creating a buzz and get people on board on the same page and really eager to make a difference does help, and does help in any function when it comes to helping other individuals and other communities more so than ever. And the empowering piece that you touched upon, especially when you said, there's 14 people and everyone has a mind set to think about social procurement. So it's not just a task that's sit with a person. Yes, you might have resources specifically dedicated to that, but embrace the culture of social procurement as a shared responsibility across the whole team. And last but not least, someone that as a marketeer myself, I believe is very important, is celebrate success. There's no better way to create positive engagement than showcasing what, the power of the outcomes you can achieve does to those communities. So, and traditionally procurement people are not very good at celebrating stuff, and we need to get out of our shells and be proud of what we're doing and communicate both internally and externally. And for those of you that are on the webinar, if you do have any story, come to CIPS, please let us know. We'll be more than happy to do an interview piece. We would like to help in creating that promotion and that awareness that will hopefully help drive many other organizations to do the same thing. Before we wrap up the session, we have Kendall Richardson, the chair of our South Australia committee, that will provide a quick update. Before I leave you and hand over to her, I just want to remind you of a couple of upcoming webinars we have. On Thursday, we have the Procurement Salary Guide presentation, and that is at noon Australian Eastern Standard Time. We'll be sharing and presenting the results of the CIPS and Hayes Procurement Salary Guide for 2020. Some amazing insight, and Sharon has given a preview of those. And the next webinar is on Friday. It's around future-proofing your career series, and it talks through the applied learning process for which CIPS helps organizations get individuals to achieve MCIPS and at the same time deliver ROI for their business. So thank you very much for joining, and don't forget to complete your survey before leaving the webinar. I'm just going to hand over to Kendall for the chair update. Thank you, Kendall.
Thanks, Gio. I just wanted to mention that we've been a bit quiet, but coming out in the next 6 months, we've got a few really exciting events coming out. So we tend to promote them through the SANT LinkedIn page as well as through CIPS. So if you want to jump on there and join us, you'll see the stuff that we share there. And just a big thank you to Caroline, who we had this planned as a live event in March, and due to COVID, it's been rescheduled a few times. So thank you to Caroline, Gio, Sharon, Sophia, and to Mel from our committee for organising and coordinating it all. So just a big thank you to everyone. Oh.